The Bible is a book full of fascinating stories, some laden with wisdom and inspiration, while others leave us perplexed or even shocked. Have you ever wondered why some passages are so strange and difficult to understand? Today we are going to explore 15 of the strangest parts of the Bible that you have probably never heard about in a sermon. These stories, often overlooked, not only transport us to a completely different historical and cultural context, but also offer deep and unexpected spiritual lessons. Get ready, because what you are about to discover may change your perception of the scriptures. Imagine reading the book of Revelation when suddenly you come across the description of bizarre creatures, locusts with human faces, hair like that of women, and teeth like those of lions. These beings emerge from the abyss, ready to torment those who do not bear the seal of God. Their surreal appearance and frightening behavior are described in detail in Revelation 9. These locusts symbolize more than just supernatural creatures. They represent divine judgment and organized chaos, led by Abaddon, the destroyer. This vision reminds us of the seriousness of the spiritual war that takes place beyond what our eyes can see, and the need to seek divine protection. Another disturbing episode is that of the lake of fire, described in Revelation 19. This is the final destination of the beast, the false prophet, and all who reject God. The lake of fire is not only a place of eternal torment, but also a symbol of God's ultimate triumph over evil. It reminds us of the importance of maintaining faith and cultivating a sincere relationship with God, for only those whose names are written in the book of life will escape this terrible judgment. This passage challenges us to reflect on the seriousness of our spiritual choices and the eternal impact they may have. And what about the vision of the Valley of Dry Bones, found in Ezekiel 37? The prophet Ezekiel is taken in spirit to a valley full of bones, which symbolize a people without hope and vitality. God orders him to prophesy to the bones, and something incredible happens. The bones begin to come together, are covered with flesh and skin, but still do not have life. Only when the Spirit of God enters them do they rise as a powerful army. This vision is a powerful metaphor for spiritual and physical restoration, showing that God can bring life and hope even in the most desperate situations. How many times do we feel like those dry bones without direction or strength? This passage reminds us that God has the power to fully restore us. Among the most terrifying visions in Revelation is the description of the beasts in Revelation 13. The first beast, which emerges from the sea, has 7 heads, 10 horns, and features that mix those of a leopard, a bear, and a lion. The second beast arises from the earth, with the appearance of a lamb, but the voice of a dragon. These creatures symbolize corrupt systems and evil forces that try to divert humanity from the divine purpose. The vision of the beasts warns us about the influence of evil, which can be subtle and deceptive, but also reminds us that its authority is temporary and subject to God's judgment. Another mysterious episode is the writing on the wall in Daniel 5. During a lavish banquet, King Belshazzar, in an act of blasphemy, uses sacred vessels from the temple in Jerusalem as mere wine goblets. Suddenly, a hand appears and writes an enigmatic message on the wall. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Daniel is called to interpret the message, which announces God's judgment against Belshazzar. That very night, the king is killed, and his kingdom is handed over to the Medes and Persians. This story teaches us about divine justice and the seriousness of honoring the sacred, reminding us that our actions are constantly weighed by God. Have you read about stoning as a punishment in Deuteronomy 21? An impressive passage describes the extreme penalty for a rebellious and disobedient son. He must be taken to the elders of the city and stoned to death. This practice may seem cruel by modern standards, but in the historical and cultural context of the time, it aimed to maintain justice and the holiness of the community. Mosaic law was severe, but it also emphasized the seriousness of sin and the need for discipline. Although stoning is no longer a Christian practice, this passage invites us to reflect on the importance of our actions and how they affect the community. An equally intriguing story is found in Matthew 8, where Jesus casts out demons from two men and allows them to enter a herd of pigs. The animals run uncontrolled toward a cliff and drown in the sea. This scene demonstrates the absolute authority of Jesus over the spiritual world and illustrates the destructive purpose of demons. However, what stands out is the reaction of the local inhabitants who ask Jesus to leave, preferring to preserve their material possessions rather than celebrate the liberation of the possessed men. This leads us to reflect on our priorities and how we react when God's work challenges our comfort. Now let's talk about one of the darkest passages of the Bible, the extreme famine during the siege of Samaria, described in 2 Kings 6. The situation was so desperate that two women even made a pact to sacrifice and consume their own children. When one of them broke the agreement, the other sought justice from the king, who, horrified, tore his garments in a sign of mourning. This brutal story reveals just how far humanity can go in moments of despair and reminds us of the consequences of being alienated from God. Despite the darkness of this event, it calls us to reflect on the importance of seeking God in times of crisis. Finally, who could forget the story of Jonah and the giant fish? Fleeing from his mission, Jonah boards a ship to Tarshish, but is cast into the sea during a storm and swallowed by a fish. Inside the animal, he reflects, prays, and repents. After 3 days, Jonah is vomited onto dry land, ready to fulfill the divine call. This story teaches us about the patience and grace of God, who offers new opportunities even when we stray from his plans. The story of the plagues of Egypt, described in the book of Exodus, is one of the most dramatic and impactful narratives in the Bible. The account begins with Moses, chosen by God to lead the Hebrews to liberation from Egyptian slavery. Pharaoh, however, refuses to free the people, hardening his heart with each new demand. Then, God sends a series of plagues upon Egypt, each one more severe than the last, showing his absolute power over all things. The first plague turns the Nile River into blood, interrupting the main source of life and prosperity in Egypt. The second plague brings an invasion of frogs, followed by lice and flies, making life unbearable for the Egyptians. As the plagues progress, God demonstrates not only his sovereignty over nature, but also directly challenges the Egyptian gods, who were revered as protectors of these aspects of life. For example, the death of livestock, the plague of boils, and the hailstorm that destroys crops and property reveal the vulnerability of the Egyptians before the true God. The 9th plague, the total darkness that covers Egypt for 3 days, is particularly significant because it directly affects Ra, the sun god, one of the most important figures in Egyptian mythology. Finally, the 10th and final plague is the most devastating. The death of all Egyptian firstborns, from the children of nobles to those of the slaves. However, the Hebrews are spared by an act of faith. Each family marks their doorposts with the blood of a lamb, symbolizing obedience to God. This plague not only forces Pharaoh to release the Hebrews, but also prophetically points to the sacrifice of Jesus, the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world. The plagues of Egypt serve as a powerful reminder that God always fulfills his promises, even in the face of great opposition. Another striking episode is the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, recounted in Genesis 19. These cities were known for their extreme wickedness and corruption. The immorality of their inhabitants reached a point where justice was demanded before God. In response, God sends 2 angels to investigate the situation and rescue Lot, Abraham's nephew. Before the destruction, Abraham intercedes for the cities, asking God to spare them if at least 10 righteous people are found. However, not even this small number is found, and judgment becomes inevitable. On the night before the destruction, the men of Sodom surround Lot's house, demanding that he deliver the visitors so that they may abuse them. This atrocious act reveals how deeply corrupted the society had become. The angels blind the men and instruct Lot to flee with his family, warning them not to look back. At dawn, God causes sulfur and fire to rain down from the heavens, completely destroying the cities. During the escape, Lot's wife disobeys the instructions and looks back, being turned into a pillar of salt. This event is not only an account of destruction, but also a warning about the consequences of disobedience and rebellion against God. Among the most symbolic stories is that of the flood in Noah's time, also told in the book of Genesis. Humanity had reached an extreme level of wickedness and violence, prompting God to decide to bring a universal judgment in the form of a flood. However, amid this judgment, there is a demonstration of divine grace. God chooses Noah, a righteous man, and his family to preserve humanity and the animals. He instructs Noah to build an ark, a huge ship that would serve as a refuge during the flood. When the flood begins, the waters cover the entire earth, destroying all forms of life except those on the ark. After 40 days and 40 nights of torrential rain, the waters start to recede, and the ark comes to rest on Mount Ararat. Upon leaving the ark, Noah and his family offer a sacrifice to God, who establishes a new covenant with them, promising never again to destroy the earth with a flood. As a sign of this covenant, God places a rainbow in the sky, an eternal symbol of his mercy. Noah's story teaches us about the seriousness of sin, the importance of obedience to God, and the hope of a new beginning. Another surprising event is the story of the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal, found in 1 Kings 18. In a period of great apostasy in Israel, when King Ahab and his wife Jezebel promoted the worship of Baal, Elijah challenges the 450 prophets of Baal to a confrontation on Mount Carmel. He proposes that each side prepare a sacrifice, but without igniting the fire, and that the true God respond by sending fire from heaven. The prophets of Baal shout and dance around their altar for hours, but nothing happens. Then Elijah prepares his sacrifice, repairs the altar of the Lord, and to increase the difficulty of the challenge, orders that large quantities of water be poured over the sacrifice and the wood. Next he prays to God, and immediately fire from heaven comes down, completely consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, and even the water around the altar. The people, upon witnessing this miracle, fall prostrate and acknowledge that the Lord is the true God. Elijah then orders the execution of the prophets of Baal, putting an end to their corrupting influence. This story not only demonstrates God's power over false gods, but also reminds us that even when it seems we are alone in our faith, God is sufficient to overcome any opposition. Lastly, we have the fascinating story of Job, a man of integrity who faces extreme suffering. In the book of Job, Satan challenges God, arguing that Job is only faithful because he is blessed with prosperity. God allows Satan to test Job with the condition that his life be spared. Job loses all his possessions, his children, and even his health. But even in the midst of pain, he refuses to curse God. Instead, he cries out for answers, seeking to understand why he is suffering. At the peak of his despair, Job is confronted by God, who, instead of providing explanations, asks a series of questions that reveal his greatness and wisdom. Faced with the immensity of God, Job humbles himself and acknowledges his limited perspective. In the end, God restores everything that Job had lost, doubling his blessings. However, the true lesson of this story is not in the material restoration, but in the understanding that faith in God must remain, even when we do not understand His ways. Among the most emblematic narratives of the Old Testament is that of the Ark of the Covenant, a symbol of God's presence among the people of Israel. In 1 Samuel 6, after the Ark is captured by the Philistines and causes great plagues in their cities, it is finally returned to the Israelite territory. The inhabitants of Beth Shemesh, upon receiving the ark with joy, commit an act of irreverence. They look inside it, disobeying divine instructions. As a result, God strikes them, causing the death of 70 men. This episode highlights the seriousness with which God demands that His holiness be respected, and reminds us that, even in sacred matters, we must act with reverence and fear. Another impactful event is the account of the children sacrificed during the siege of Samaria, described in 2 Kings 6. This dark episode reveals the extreme level of despair to which humanity can descend in times of famine and crisis. During the siege imposed by the Aramean army, the situation becomes so unbearable that two women make a pact to sacrifice and consume their own children. When one of them hides her child after the first terrible act, the other seeks the intervention of the king. This story shows us the devastating consequences of a society estranged from God, but it also reminds us that even in the darkest moments, divine restoration is possible, as occurs shortly thereafter when God intervenes miraculously and frees the city from the siege. Speaking of moments of despair and redemption, the story of Jonah and the giant fish is one of the most symbolic in the Bible. Jonah, when trying to flee from the divine call to preach in Nineveh, ends up being cast into the sea during a storm and is swallowed by a great fish. For 3 days and 3 nights, he remains in the belly of the animal, where he reflects and repents. After this period, Jonah is vomited onto dry land and finally fulfills his mission, leading the city of Nineveh to repentance. This account not only highlights the patience and grace of God, but also reminds us that even when we try to escape His purpose, He can bring us back to the right path in unexpected ways. Another episode that arouses great curiosity is Ezekiel's vision in the Valley of Dry Bones. Found in Ezekiel 37, this passage describes the prophet being led by the Spirit of God to a valley filled with dry bones. God orders Ezekiel to prophesy over the bones, and in a supernatural manner, they begin to come together, covering themselves with flesh and skin. However, they only gain life when the Spirit of God enters them. This vision is a powerful metaphor for spiritual restoration, showing that God can bring life and hope even in the most desperate situations. It reminds us that with God, even what seems completely lost can be restored. Finally, the story of Job's torment is one of the most profound accounts of suffering, faith, and redemption. Job, a just and upright man, is tested in an extreme manner, losing everything he owns, including his children and his health. Yet even in the face of such overwhelming pain, he refuses to curse God, maintaining his faith even as he questions the reason for his suffering. In the end, God not only restores everything that Job had lost, but also reveals to him His sovereignty and wisdom, showing that there are divine purposes beyond human comprehension. Job's story teaches us that even in the most difficult moments, our faith in God must remain unshakable, for He is in control of all things. These surprising and often disturbing stories show us that the Bible is much more than just a religious book. It contains profound lessons about human nature, divine justice, and redemption. As we explore these passages, we are challenged to reflect on our own lives, our choices, and our relationship with God. Although some of these stories are difficult to understand at first glance, they offer us a unique perspective on the divine plan and remind us of the importance of remaining steadfast in our faith, regardless of the circumstances. If you enjoyed this content and want to continue exploring the mysteries and wonders of the Bible, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. May God bless you and see you next time.